Hello once more, my... friends from all around the globe. So, 1.19.2 just went live, and with that, Mahjong have finally fixed all the exploits with chat reporting once and for all. Or have they? Because I fear to tell you that, even in the best case scenario, the answer would be it's complicated. They have definitely made the system more resilient to being exploited, however, their current solution comes with a lot of ifs and trade-offs. It comes with a lot of complexity too, so I may not be able to communicate all the whys and hows of this video in simple terms like I did before. But don't worry too much if some technical details go entirely over your head. Hopefully I will still be able to get my points across. I also want this video to be a bit standalone from my previous videos, so you don't have to watch them if you missed out. I will give you a brief summary of everything you need to understand right here. In pre-release 3, Mahjong have finally added special indication for system messages in the form of this grey bar to the left. And with that, only show secure chat have finally become something more than completely useless garbage. It still feels like one giant afterthought to me, but at least now it works as advertised. Next, in Release Candidate 3, we have finally lost the ability to report unsigned player messages, or messages with invalid signatures. This ultimately is another good thing, because it is an explicit confirmation from Mahjong that they will not consider unsigned messages as valid evidence, which they never were to begin with. Finally, now when you connect to the server that has Enforce Secure Profile disabled, you will get this warning. And this is the first thing they completely screwed up, intentionally or not, because the text of this warning does not actually reflect the truth of what is happening. While servers with Enforce Secure Profile disabled give players the power to send unsigned messages, it doesn't mean every player will actually use it, and unless you get messages with modified or not secure trust status, you can be pretty sure they were relayed unmodified. If I am to guess why this warning was added in the first place, it seems to be a measure to simply scare unaware people away from servers with disabled Enforce Secure Profile. There was a lot of speculation that chat trust status was added for the exact same purpose, and now that I think about it, it seems to make some more sense. Also, yeah, there's a variety of ways to circumvent this on both client and server, so in practice this warning isn't much to worry about. Alright, let's quickly break down 4 basic terms that you need to understand in order to comprehend the rest of this video. Specifically, hash, public key, private key, and signature. People who are already familiar with those are probably rolling their eyes over the fact we'll be covering such a basic stuff, but they can skip this part using timestamps in the description, and you can stick around if you're not one of them. So, hash is something that can be generated by plugging arbitrary data into hashing function of your choice. Different hashing functions represent different algorithms that can determine the exact logical procedure for generating that hash. In theory, there's a lot of ways hashing function can work, but in practice it has to meet a few specific requirements to be useful in cryptography. First, it has to be deterministic, so if you plug in the same data, or more specifically the same sequence of bytes into the hashing function, it must produce the same hash every time. Second, it has to be computationally infeasible to reverse the hashing function. So just having a hash of some data will not let you know what data was plugged in to generate it. Third, hashes have to be easy to verify. So if you have both the hash and the data that it was supposedly generated against, you can quickly check whether that is actually true or not. And fourth, it has to be chaotic. So even if you change a single bit of input data, the resulting hash will look completely different. Notice that in this context, just like in science, chaotic does not mean random. It rather means very hard to predict. Typically, there's no restriction on how much data you can plug into the hashing function at once. You can do it with a few bytes, or you can do it with a file that is terabytes in size, doesn't matter. The output is going to be fixed in size though. In the case of Minecraft's chat sign-in, it uses SHA-256 for hashing, and the output of that is 32 bytes or 128 bits long. But is this true, I hear you asking? If hash is only 32 bytes long, doesn't that mean that there's a lot more possible terabyte-sized files than hashes that can be generated from them? Isn't the whole idea of hash is that it has to correspond to a unique sequence of input data? I'm so glad that you ask, because you see, even with only 32 bytes of size, the amount of possible hashes equals 2 to the power of 128, which means that if we assume that cosmological principle is true, then transformation of entire observable universe in the supercomputer will still leave you with. And then you have to consider entropy, because low entropy of most data that you hash means very few byte sequences will produce desired hash while remaining complete. But if we integrate over y equals the square root of, and then you run up against the speed of light limit, which you have to factor into your calculations because dark and curvature of space-time itself gets in your way. And even if we assume that negative energy density is possible on macroscopic scale. And so, the bottom line is, collisions are possible, but they are highly improbable, and for all practical purposes we can just neglect them and assume that every input does produce unique output.
Ну нахер. Отец. Ну ты видел?
Now, signature is something that is very similar to hash, with a few exceptions. To generate a signature, you need private key, and to verify that it is correct, you need public key that is associated with private key used to generate it. You also still need data that signature will be verified against, which allows you to gain certainty that data you have is exactly the same data that signature was generated for. Public key is derived from private key, and knowing public key does not allow you to know that private key. So even though you can verify signatures using public key and get certainty they were generated by the owner of private key, you cannot generate such signatures yourself. In this simple example from Wikipedia, for instance, Alice has private key and Bob knows her public key. So Alice can sign a message that she sends to the Bob using private key, and Bob can verify that the signature was generated by Alice and that the message he receives was not tampered with along the way. In Minecraft, we will do something very similar to this, except more sophisticated. And with that, your basic introduction into cryptography is over, and you can safely add cryptography specialist to your resume. For those who didn't get some parts of my explanation or want to learn more, there's a few sources linked in the description that you can go and check out. So, the idea is that now every Minecraft account has private and public keys provided by Mojang, which are used for the purpose of signing your chat messages. This flowchart illustrates how your keys are obtained by your own client and how public key is relayed to the server and subsequently other connected clients. When you start up the game, your client communicates with Mojang's authentication services to obtain private key of your account and public key together with some extra data. Beyond the key itself, that data includes its expiry date and signature that is generated by Mojang for your public key. Expiry date means that every key pair that you get will only be valid for a limited period of time. Right now there seems to be 48 hours since key pair is generated, but it might change in the future. Once your key pair expires, Mojang services will generate a different key pair for you, and you will obtain it at the next game startup. Mojang's signature is something that is generated using their own private key. We don't know what their private key is, and we don't have to know. We just know that it exists. The data it is generated against includes your public key, its expiry date, and unique ID of your account. When you connect to the server, you send to it some info about your account, which includes aforementioned unique ID, as well as public key data. The server will try to verify Mojang's signature for your public key using Mojang's own public key, which it grabs from Authentication Library. You download the Authentication Library automatically when you install either client or server. It is provided by Mojang directly. Verifying this signature allows the server to be sure that public key you sent to it was actually issued by Mojang for your specific account. It will then relay data about you to other clients, and they will do their own independent verification of your public key data using Mojang's public key from their own distribution of Authentication Library. Even in this relatively simple process of obtaining and communicating keys, there used to exist major vulnerabilities. The first one of them was that Mojang's signature generated for account's public key did not include unique ID of that account. That meant that key pairs were kind of disconnected from whatever accounts they were actually issued for, and you could pass another account's keys as your own to the server and other clients on it. Using that key pair, you could then sign your chat messages such that they would look completely legitimate but could not serve as valid evidence in case of chat reports. That also made only show secure chat option completely useless. This specific issue was silently fixed in release candidate 1 of 1.19.1. The fix isn't mentioned in the changelogs or anywhere else. We could say that it wasn't significant enough to mention if the whole signature system was just work in progress and this vulnerability did not make it into the actual release of the game. But keep in mind that signature system was originally introduced in 1.19 and this problem still exists there. The second problem is that key pairs used to be cached in profile keys folder of .minecraft directory. They were stored in plain text, which is a major oversight from the standpoint of security because sensitive data should never be stored in plain text. This was silently fixed in pre-release 6 of 1.19.1 and now key pairs are not cached at all. Once again, if you boot up 1.19 client, you will still see your key pair cached, so this vulnerability also made it into the release version of the game. I have no idea why the fix wasn't announced. Now, I suggest that we take a look at how message signing used to work up until pre-release 4 to understand what problems it had. Once again, feel free to skip this part if you already know. So, when you typed a message into the chat, your client collected some data that was going to be sent to the server as part of your message. That data included text of the message itself, your unique user ID, timestamp, which is the exact time on your computer, and salt, which is completely random number. Your client would then generate a signature against this message data using private key that it obtained at startup and send message data with signature to the server. Server would check validity of the signature using public key you have sent to it, then grab some info about your account, which also included user ID as well as your username, and send all that to connected clients, which would verify the signature themselves using your public key that the server relayed to them. If clients had only show secure chat option enabled in chat settings, then the message would only be displayed if attached signature is valid. Otherwise, it would display regardless. So, what are the problems with this naive approach to chat signing? Well, in case you wanted to make use of it as a player, the obvious one was that there was no visual distinction between system messages and signed or unsigned player messages. So, the server could easily mimic legit player messages regardless of whether you had only show secure chat option enabled or not. As far as I can tell, this is no longer the problem thanks to implementation of chat trust status. However, this fix did not actually require any changes to the underlying signature system, only to how your client visually represents the data that it had anyways. Much more alarming problems arise when you contemplate how the system can be used in the case of chat reporting. Because while every individual message has a signature that can be used to verify its contents, nothing really stands in the way of not including some of the messages in the report. You can easily remove specific messages from yourself or other players, and everything will look as if they weren't there to begin with. You can also fabricate your own messages, which you never actually send to the server, and retroactively inject them at any point in the reported evidence. Since you have access to your own private key, you can generate valid signature for those fabricated messages, and once again, there will be no telling them apart from real ones. There was, and still is, a mod called Gaslight, which serves as a very clear proof of concept on how this can be exploited. Before we examine what Mojang did to fix context manipulation exploits, I feel obliged to mention that a lot of people in the comments on my previous videos have suggested seemingly simple and obvious solutions that should easily fix those. Let's quickly take a look at them. The first and most common one is what I call naive blockchain approach, where every message that someone sends into the chat includes the hash of whatever was previous message, and client generates a signature against all other message data plus this hash. In a simple example represented by this flowchart, message from Alice comes first, there is no previous messages to include hashes from in her message. Mark's hello, however, will already include the hash of her message as part of signed data. The "How's your weekend?" message from Alice includes the hash of Mark's message, and so on. On the surface, this seems to perfectly solve our problem, because now if you remove something from this chain of messages, it will be immediately obvious something is missing. If you try to change something in the middle of it or inject something that wasn't there, all the signatures after that point will become invalid. You can regenerate your own signatures, but not signatures of other people. So, where's the problem? The first problem here is that this solution completely fails to consider latency. It takes measurable time for your client to deliver a message to the server. In video games, this is typically called ping. It will obviously be different depending on your location and connection quality, but it's not uncommon to see it around hundreds of milliseconds. So, with that in mind, imagine that two different players send different messages around the same time. It doesn't have to match perfectly, but the idea is that each one of the players sends a message before the message from another player reaches them. As such, those two messages will refer to the same message in the chat for the hash. And now we get what's called a fork in the chain. How exactly we decide which message is the correct one? If we just drop one of them, for instance, that means on big servers people will constantly get their messages dropped because they will hit that spot where they send a message at roughly the same time as another player. The second, much bigger problem is that different players can receive different messages. Consider MSG command. When you use it, only the player that you actually want to send the message to receives it. And now, you and that player will build a chain that includes this private message, but other people on the server will not, because it never reaches them. How do we decide which chain is correct? Another example could be plugins that give you local chat, so that when you send a message, it only reaches players within certain proximity of you. So, as you can see, naive blockchain just doesn't work. A more original approach that I have seen is to assign a special index to every message that will be sent into the chat, which will be incremented after every message. This index then goes into the message signature, and in principle you can see if something is missing from chat report by those indexes. However, if we let clients increment the index on their own, we once again run up against latency, and every once in a while two messages will arrive to the server with the same index. We can work around this by saying that when client tries to send a message, it will first ask the server to provide the index for it, then include server's index into the signed data, and only then send a message back to the server. But first, this has an unfortunate side effect of increasing latency when sending chat messages 3 times over. Second, it implies that we can trust the server to manage index incrementation, which we obviously cannot because entire signature system is based on not having to trust the server. This solution also doesn't have a way to address MSG or other cases where different players can receive different messages. If we accept that certain indexes can be missing from chat report under the assumption that those messages simply never reached the player, it immediately gives players the power to exclude any messages from the evidence, his own or otherwise. And final nail into the coffin of indexation, you can still easily alter the contents of the messages you yourself sent, as well as drop messages from other players and insert your own fabricated messages with indexes they had. So, unfortunately, indexation doesn't work as well. Those aren't the only ingenious solutions that I have seen from people, but those couple examples should be enough to get my point across. And my point is, if you don't have a deep technical understanding of the system, then whatever simple and elegant solution is it that have suddenly dawned upon you, it will most likely not work because you have failed to consider all the necessary details. I and many other mod developers have thought this through many times, and current scientific consensus is that simple solution does not exist here. Now we can finally take a look at what Mojang have actually done to fix context manipulation. First, every chat message is now separated into 2 parts, body and header. Message body is what contains text of the message itself, as well as salt and timestamp, which work the same as before. It also contains the list of last seen signatures, and every entry in this list contains unique ID of the player and the signature of the message from that player which your client have received most recently. The header, on the other hand, contains your unique user ID, signature of previous header, hash of the message body, and a signature generated with your private key against those 3 things above. Together, all this comprises full data of your every chat message. Now, let's break down what different parts of the structure do. Signature of previous header is going to be coming from previous chat message that you yourself have sent. So, if you just logged into the server and you send your first message, this is just going to be empty, and signature of that first header will be generated only against user ID and hash of message body. That signature will be used when sending second message to generate signature of the second header, and signature of the second header will be used in third message, and so on. What this achieves is that now all of your messages are sort of chained together. This is not dissimilar to naive blockchain we have discussed earlier, but the difference here is that every player has their own chain of messages, so we don't face problems that appear when everyone has to reach consensus with a single centralized chain, while still giving us the benefit of being easily able to see if messages are removed from the middle of someone's chain. If you try to change or add messages within your own chain, it will also have the effect of changing all hashes and signatures down that chain. By itself, it would achieve nothing if chains remained completely disconnected from one another, but they are not. This is where this last seen signatures list becomes important, because it allows to establish what were the last messages you have seen from different players at the time you sent your own. Each entry in this list represents a unique player, such that it can be verified what was the last message from every individual one. Up to 5 different players can fit into the list at once, which is a reasonable limit for all practical purposes. We definitely do not want to leave the list unrestricted, because imagine that there's 100 different players on a server and everyone writes something into the chat at some point. Since every message signature is 256 bytes long, 100 different signatures will add up to around 25 kilobytes, which is a bit much data to be sent in with every single chat message. And just in case you're still confused, the reason you cannot change your message on the client before sending a report is because that would change signatures of all messages that were sent by you after the point you are trying to change. Meanwhile, other players' last seen signature lists would contain signatures that were produced by your original unmodified chain. And since those lists go into their personal signatures, which you cannot reforge, you cannot retroactively alter your messages in a report. If you wonder how exactly all that looks when it is sent to Mojang, here's one of the report payloads I have intercepted with my custom mod in 1.19.1. As you can see, each message in an array indeed contains header and body, which in turn contain everything else we just talked about. It's worth noticing that salt is no longer a random integer number, it is now a random double, but really this doesn't change much from functional perspective. Besides this new data, format remains pretty much the same as we observed in reports on pre-release 2 and prior, some examples of which you could observe in my earlier videos. By the way, some of you have asked me how to intercept reports in the manner similar to what I do. I don't really want to bother making a full-on project for the tool I am using, but I will upload a compiled Fabric version of it and link in the description in case you want to use it. You just install it as any other Fabric mod, and when you try to send the report from your client, it will be saved in intercepted reports folder in your .minecraft directory instead of going to Mojang. Feel free to use it for testing or your own research. Going back to our flowcharts, the fundamental idea here is that every client now inhabits its own reality of chat messages, which can be vastly different from the reality other players see. That reality is recorded with last seen signatures into every chat message that it sends. If you want a bit of technical terminology, hash of message body and list of last seen signatures are both an example of cryptographic commitment. Let me illustrate how this works in a practical example. Here we have a conversation between 3 people. Bob goes first and says, "Hey guys." This is the beginning of his personal chain of messages, and list of last seen signatures for this message will be empty. He then sends a message asking, "You good?" and that message will already contain signature from the header of his previous message as part of signed data. His previous message also makes its way into the list of the ones he have last seen. Alice is the first to reply, and her reply starts her own chain of messages. It will also include Bob's message in last seen signatures, creating a cryptographic proof that Alice have actually seen that message, and it is indeed the one she have seen most recently before sending her own. Mark is quick to follow with his own reply to Bob's question, and his list of last seen signatures will already include 2 messages, one from Alice, the most recent one, and second one from Bob. And finally, Bob sends a reply to both of them. This reply will take last header signature from his "you good" message, and the list of last seen signatures will include a message from Mark, a message from Alice, and his own message in this specific order. And keep in mind that order matters here, because if you change order of entries in list of last seen signatures, hash of message body will also change, as well as header signature generated from that hash, and so on down the line. Let's now consider how the system works when different players receive different messages. In this example, private messages, which can be sent using MSG command, for instance, are color-coded with respect to the person who is supposed to receive them. So, Alice sends a private message to Bob, to which he swiftly replies. The last seen signatures in his reply will include the signature of the message sent by Alice. She proceeds to state her opinion on Mark, and last seen signatures of this message will include a message from the Bob and her own previous message. Finally, Bob sends a message into the public chat, and this becomes the first message Mark can actually see. So when he replies to it, last seen signatures in his reply will only include public message by the Bob. Even though Alice have been sending some messages through the server, he did not actually see her messages. Her final message will include last seen signatures from all three participants. So, as you can see, cryptographic signatures in this system actually do a great job at accurately reflecting what different players see, by accepting the fact that different players can receive different messages. There is only one detail that this flowchart doesn't capture, because in reality, when the server doesn't relay your message to everyone, players who did not receive it will still receive a message header from it. This is done to allow clients to verify integrity of message chains from other clients. So even if the server doesn't actually let you know what the contents or body of the message were, you will still know that given player have sent a message to someone, so when you receive their next message, you can verify that it is still a part of the same chain. Those kinds of bodiless headers are actually not included at all when you make a chat report, so it only helps clients to verify chains of other clients in real time. This might be changed in the future, but for what we will discuss further, it actually isn't all that important. Final thing we have to discuss in this section are validation rules for list of last seen signatures. They are enforced by the server, and to verifiable extent, they are expected to hold true in a case of chat reports. First, your list of last seen signatures can only grow or stay the same size, never shrink. So you cannot unsee messages from other players after you already acknowledged them. Second, each player can only occupy one unique entry in that list. Your list of signatures cannot contain two messages from the same player at once, regardless of whether messages themselves are same or different. Third, your list cannot contain messages that server does not know of. This rule is not verifiable in the case of chat reports, obviously, but it means that if the server you play on is not modified, you cannot just make up random signatures and stuff them into your list. And fourth, you cannot put a message in your list that chronologically precedes a last message from that player you have previously acknowledged. So you cannot just unsee some messages from a given player and go back to older ones after you already said you have seen them. Those rules might seem kind of obvious, but it's important to keep in mind that they exist. Probably one of the most complicated things you need to understand about new system are context selection rules, or how exactly your client determines what messages go into the report when you try to make one. It worked very simply with old system. For every message selected for reporting, reported evidence would include 7 player messages before that one and 2 after, regardless of whoever sent them. But new rules are quite a bit more elaborate than that. So, the idea now is that for every message selected, your client grabs a message immediately before that one in that player's chain, if known, plus every known message that is referenced as last seen in selected message. Then, it takes those newly grabbed messages and goes through each, trying to once again select directly linked ones and all last seen ones. And this process goes on recursively. I get it might be hard to picture, so let me give you some visual examples. In this example, Bob is the only one who says anything. There's also Alice, who receives one private message from him, and you, who will supposedly try to report Bob. Imagine you select the last message he sends for report, and we will mark directly selected message with red color. Next, your client tries to grab the message that is directly referenced by signature of previous header in the one selected, which will be this one. Your client can see it, so it goes into the report, and that is marked with yellow. Then, for this message, it tries to grab the one immediately before, once again successfully, and then it finally runs up against this private message, which in case of real conversation your client would not be able to see. It would know that Bob sent a private message to someone, and that someone is not you, but not what the message itself is. This is where Bob's chain kind of breaks, and your client will stop selection right here. Notice that even though there is one more public message Bob have sent before that, it is kind of disconnected from segment on the right by unknown private message, so it does not go into the report. So far, so simple. Now, let's try to make Alice a more active participant of this conversation. 3 of Bob's messages go into the report in the exact same way as before, but the one in the middle now refers to one of the public messages from Alice as last seen, so it also gets dragged into the context. Her private message is also referred as last seen by one of Bob's messages, but since you did not receive contents of that message, it does not make it into the report. Hereby, her first public message is now disconnected from selected chain segments, so it also ends up being omitted from the report. And in this final example, you finally become participant of the conversation too. However, notice that your private messages are only sent to Alice and not to the Bob. The only reason they end up dragged into the context is because one of them is referenced from message by Alice, which in turn is referenced from message by Bob, which in turn is selected by going down the Bob's chain from the one initially selected. This should serve as an illustration of that recursive saying I have mentioned. Your first message gets included here because it is directly referenced by signature of previous header in second one, and since you are the sender, obviously you know all messages in your own chain, private or otherwise. The only thing that doesn't manifest in those examples is still existing limit on how many messages can be included in evidence per every message reported. That limit is 9. So if you apply context selection rules like we discussed and you end up grabbing more than 9 messages that fit those rules, only 9 chronologically most recent ones will be included. I realize all of this might have felt like excessively long and pretty boring lecture, but understanding how message chains are structured and how context selection rules are applied will allow you to understand why certain exploits with chat reporting no longer work, as well as how and why exploits that do exist actually work. So, next time someone will claim they have found an exploit with the system, you will be able to independently assess whether they actually know what they are talking about. Isn't that cool? Because I would totally feel cool in your place. And by the way, if you want any of my flowcharts, they are linked in the description. If you want to use them for anything, go ahead, just give credit and you're good. Also, shout out to those guys on screen for helping me run some of my experimental tests to see how updated chat signing/reporting works and confirm some of my hypotheses. In case you didn't know, yes, I do have a Discord server, which you can totally join to chat with me or other people who like my mods and other stuff I do. Invite link is also in the description. When Release Candidate 2 was out, a lot of people who defend chat reporting were quick to jump to conclusions and shout at every corner that Mojang have fixed absolutely all exploits with the system and it is completely infallible now. And then, on the day 1.19.1 finally released, guess why developers have released an update video that demonstrates how their mod supposedly still works, allowing you to fabricate context just as fine as before. And then the other side was quick to shout at them, immediately trying to debunk their mod, calling it a hoax and firmly reiterating that the system is not exploitable in any way. So, who is right and who is wrong? In reality, they are both wrong. The reason guess why developers are wrong is because first, they have made far-fetched assumptions about how reports will be validated by Mojang's receiving system. But more importantly, they have failed to properly assess context selection rules that we have just discussed. At the time their first video went viral, I have already published my video on the exploit, which provided technical background on why what they are doing is possible. Their second video, however, didn't have any source that would reliably back up or falsify it. This is exactly what caused a lot of misunderstanding in the community. And let's dissect what exactly they show. First, a player who intends to make malicious report sends incriminating question as private message to themselves. Then they send public message with more harmless question, to which target of the report, in this case Geldwäsche, replies yes. And then they demonstrate how they remove public question from the context before actually filing a report. But let's see what this translates to when we represent this as one of our flowcharts. In this case, Ada's messages are connected to the message from Geldwäsche thanks to the fact he have seen the last of them. So by default, a report would include all three messages. But what happens if you remove this one in the middle? Well, now it will be obvious that Geldwäsche have seen a message from the Ada, but actual message he have seen did not get included in the report. And since Ada is the one making report, she is supposed to know all messages she herself sent. You cannot just write this off as her not knowing what the message was, so from report it will be immediately obvious she have tried to hide something. Moreover, with removal of this message, the first one, which actually contains incriminating question, becomes completely disconnected from message by Geldwäsche, which is reported. According to the context selection rule, then, it should not even be included in the report, and if it ends up there anyways, this will be second, blatant indication that report has been tampered with. To conclude, the exploit they are trying to show in this video does not work. Now, the reason defenders of chat reporting are wrong is because they have seen that most prominent feature of updated Gaslight does not work, so they immediately dismissed any possibility any of its features are actually functional. That is not correct either. Ultimately, a lot of confusion came from the fact that very few people actually fully understand how current signature system works, and at the same time are willing to share that information with general public. Most exploit developers obviously don't bother doing it, that's not their interest, and people who debunk those exploits typically don't have patience to sit down and do proper research on the matter. But luckily, you have me. So let's examine exploits that really exist at this time and try to understand not just how, but why they work. Let's start with a simple example where we have a chain of messages from Bob alone. This chain gives us an easy attack vector if we can arbitrarily remove any messages from it. And in theory, we can. If we remove this message, in the report it will, of course, be immediately obvious that there was at least one message between his 15 and that was some great time. However, exactly the same thing would happen if Bob sent that message in DMs to someone and it simply never reached the person who makes a report. So we have a legitimate premise to omit certain messages from report. Accounting for context selection rules, if you only select his last message for report, context selection will have to stop at missing link, which will be this correction message in the middle. However, we can manually select up to 4 different messages to report, and selection will extend from each one independently. So what we can do in this case is just select the message immediately before excluded correction, or, all 4 messages that remain. This power comes with certain limitations, however. If your report includes a message from you with last seen signatures that include removed message, it will be immediately obvious that you have tampered with evidence. It will also be obvious if you try to remove your own messages, because it's highly unlikely that after sending a message to the server, you yourself will not see it while someone else will. This last limitation can be alleviated if you do what I call bystander report. The idea is that you log into the server from 2 different accounts and use one for chatting and another one for actual reporting, which then allows you to omit any messages whatsoever. And yet, you have to consider that even though we have a legitimate premise to not include some messages in report, it doesn't necessarily mean that matching system will consider such reports valid. They can easily choose to dismiss those to not accept the risk of someone deliberately excluding messages, even if it means some legit reports will not have any action taken on them. The truth is that we simply cannot know whether they will do it one way or another, so we have to make assumptions about how it will be. This also applies to some of the other potential exploits, and this is really unfortunate because it means that we can only speculate until someone not only tries to abuse the system this way, but will also publish the results they get, which exploit users are not exactly known for doing very often, especially when their exploits actually work. Now, let's take a look at one exploit that definitely works, regardless of any assumptions. I call this one Hidden Variables exploit. In this case, Alice is the one trying to incriminate Mark. So she logs into the server from 2 different accounts, herself and dummy account that will just stand there doing nothing. She sends 2 messages in DMs to her dummy account, and then sends 3rd message in DMs to Mark, which is the one he replies to. the last seen signatures in his reply will contain this last message from Alice, and that would be the only thing in there, even if he did receive 2 previous ones from her. In the context of reports themselves, there's really no way to tell which message is supposed to go to which player, since that just isn't a part of signed data. The only way you can infer that is using last seen signatures, which in this case will look identical regardless of where first 2 messages from Alice have gone. The end result is that in the report everything will look as if entire conversation took place between Alice and Mark, which was not the case. Obviously the example here is pretty silly, this will not get anyone banned. In truth, I could not come up with a scenario that would properly make use of this exploit, but it is probably the biggest one that exists right now, because to use it you don't even need a modified client or any mods, you can do it just like here with vanilla client. The only downside is that you have to do it in real time, you cannot just retroactively inject desired messages into the context after conversation already happened. Next exploit I want to discuss is not offensive, so it will not allow you to incriminate someone, instead it will allow you to protect yourself from being reported. Now, obviously that's not hard to do if you are a server owner who doesn't want chat reporting to work on their server, because there's a variety of mods and plugins that you can install on server to make entire chat unreportable, including my No Chat Reports mod. Worst case, we can disable enforce secure profile in server properties, and then players are completely free to protect themselves by not signing their messages. But imagine none of that is the case. Imagine server owner is really insistent that chat reporting is fully functional on their server. What you can do is pretend that you never see any messages from other players ever. In this example, Mark is doing exactly that. Despite participating in the conversation, he sends a message with empty last seen signatures list, even though normally it would contain last seen signatures from Bob and Alice. And what happens now is that there is no way to connect his messages to the rest of the conversation, or even be sure he participated in this conversation and not some different one. According to the context selection rules, if you try to report Mark's message, other messages will not even be included in your report because they lack connection to his message. But why, I hear you asking? Isn't it obvious that Mark is balking us and we just shouldn't trust what he says he have seen? Well, the thing is, we must trust, because consider the opposite case. Imagine Alice gets blown up by creepers a couple times and she says, "God, I hate them so much," in chat. From report itself, it will not be known what she actually reacted to, because messages about her death are considered system messages, and system messages don't have any connection to player message chains, they are never included in the report. And now Bob can incriminate her by retroactively injecting a question about black people in his report. Obviously, Alice have never seen that message, and her list of last seen signatures will not include it. But if we do not trust Alice, then we can conclude that she just tries to get around chat reporting by refusing to see Bob's message. This is a simple example, but you can extend it further. You can use multiple accounts to fabricate an entire conversation with multiple participants that all agree on a single reality of chat messages. Only the person who are being reported will not agree with that. So we must always trust the reality of reported person, because otherwise we immediately give people the power to fabricate context of the report in the exact same way as with old signature system. Another reason clients should have the power to not see chat messages is because you can hide messages from any given person in social interaction screen. When you do that, even though server sends you messages from them, you will obviously not actually see them, so it doesn't make sense to ever include those in your last seen signatures list. So you can protect yourself from context-based reports by simply refusing to cryptographically acknowledge messages from other players. Obviously this doesn't make you fully immune to reports, because context isn't the only defining factor. If you shout in the chat, "I hate racial minorities," in a single message, then context doesn't really matter, this will get you banned every time. This specific exploit is already available as part of proof of concept mod from developers of Gaslight. It's called Guardian, and its publication on Modrints was unfortunately not approved. But I will link its GitHub repository in the description, for now they publish releases there. I also planned to integrate such feature in No Chat Reports mod, but on a second thought, I don't think I wanna do that. For that, there are 2 reasons. First, this exploit works against the will of the server, which pretty much means that it falls into the same category as X-Ray, QAura, and other tools that commonly come packaged with cheat clients. Second, I believe that if you encounter a server that is really insistent on enforcing signed chat and have chat reporting system working there, then what you should really do is just not play on that server. Don't give it traffic, don't give it player base, just go play on servers that actually want to collaborate with their players. And if somebody actually likes chat reporting, they can play the game the way that they like, and you can easily play it otherwise elsewhere. Now, if Mahjong start actively taking action against mods and plugins that prevent chat signing, that will be another conversation, and that will give us the premise to play more aggressively. However, we don't have it just yet, and I maintain hope that we never will. And final semi-exploit that I want to cover emerges from one detail that I mentioned earlier, that even when server doesn't actually give you message the player have sent, you still receive a header of that message. That way you can easily monitor when someone sends a message in DMs to someone else, and when someone else sends a public message with last seen signatures including signature of unknown message, you can establish that they were the person who actually received it. Once again, guess why developers were quick to make this into a proof of concept mod? It's called Girl Boss, and it basically allows you to spy on other players in the exact way that I described. I personally don't find it that concerning, because you still have no idea what contents of those private messages actually are, but it still feels like a bit of privacy violation, considering that the only reason this happens is because of chat reporting and the way in which Mahjong fixed context manipulation exploits. I can see why some people would really not like this. The thing that I personally am most concerned with is that we have at least one potential exploit, performance of which will fully depend on how chat reports are validated by Mahjong system after you send a report. And that is not something we can know for sure, we can only hope that they are competent enough to make right design choices. When 1.19.1 had its first pre-releases, community of mod developers was quick to examine the code and point out massive problems with signature system as it was. However, we cannot see the code that runs on Mahjong's services. If they screw it up there, it may take a very long time before someone who has experimentally figured out exploitability of the system will actually make their work public, and we can know that this is happening. How many thousands of people will end up falsely banned in such case before something is done? I fear to even imagine. It is a matter of belief, of course, a matter of whether you are willing to trust Mahjong's word and believe they will get it all right first try, even though they have repeatedly failed to do that in the past. I expressed my attitude towards such beliefs many times, but this time I want to hear yours. Let me know in the comments what do you think about all this. And on that note, I think we can finally end this video. I didn't feel like diving too much into my opinion on chat reporting here, which for reference did undergo some evolution since I last stated it. Even filled with purely objective research, that was still a lot of information to cover. Maybe I will make another conversational video about chat reporting, but no promises on that. A lot of people already said most of what I think and formulated it better than I can. This video took me a while to make, and one of the reasons is that on July 19th, my grandfather died. Well, technically not by the blood, but family is family, and I knew him since I knew myself. Cancer. He was in his 60s, so wasn't really a short life. I kind of already got over this, don't worry too much. Those last months pretty much our entire family knew where this was going. So, it wasn't really a shock to anyone. He was buried on his land in Ukraine. I wish I could attend the funeral, but that damnable war is in the way. If I cross the border, I'm not going back. Anyways, his work might be over, but I live on, and memory of him will persist with me. A man dies twice, as they say, and I hope that second death will never get him. That is all.